Napoleon once remarked, "Nothing succeeds in war like a good plan." But the Austrian army had not fully grasped this when planning to meet up with the Russians at Austerlitz, where the two armies were to fight Napoleon himself. The rendezvous was fixed for the 16th of October. Unfortunately, the Austrian planners hadn't realized that their allies, the Russians, still used the old Julian calendar. It's 12 days behind.
To victory!
The Russian army arrived on time, only to find that the Austrian army had already surrendered. The hopes and dreams of bygone armies. Of their plans, only half ever stood any chance of success. Because war doesn't go to plan. If it did, both sides would win.
When IBM makes a major planning blunder, as it did in failing to see the importance of the personal computer, then millions of dollars are lost. When the German General Staff makes an error, millions of lives are lost. So we tend to be much more critical of planning errors in the military than of planning errors in, say, business.
Throughout history, commanders had been their own planners. Battles were improvised. It was all up to the general. But in the 19th century, the Germans brought professionalism to the pursuit of war. Germany was a new nation with new borders to defend, but surrounded by old enemies. The romance of war was out. Bureaucracy and technology were in. The Germans saw that railways could mobilize war and bring quick victories. But railways meant timetables, and timetables meant planners. 600 young officers were installed in a brand new college, the German General Staff.
A myth had grown up that the German General Staff was the greatest organization in world history. Not only the greatest military organization, the greatest organization. These guys had a fantastically high sense of their own professional superiority and regarded the armies of other countries, particularly Britain, as a bit of a joke.
But this superiority would soon be put to the test. Germany's rise as an aggressive new superpower had ratcheted up tensions in Europe. She had taken Alsace-Lorraine from the French and cancelled a peace treaty with Russia. So France and Russia retaliated by forming a military alliance. Now, if war came, Germany would have to fight both of them. A war on two fronts could be disastrous for Germany. She might have the best army, but it was still smaller than her enemies. The man handed this problem was Count Alfred von Schlieffen, a consummate professional. A man who was known to read military history to his daughters at bedtime.
The story goes that he was out riding with two of his junior staff officers one day. They see a landscape, and one of the officers says, "Isn't that beautiful?" And Schlieffen looks and says, "A minor tactical obstacle." Whatever Schlieffen was as a human being is less important than his cultivation of that image. If he hadn't existed, the German General Staff Corps would have created him.
In the event of war, Russia, the Great Bear, would be slow to mobilize. France would be quicker. The answer must be for Germany to move swiftly against France, defeat her, and then turn on Russia. But how to do that? France's border was so heavily fortified. Yet there was a chink in her armor. Belgium was neutral, so France had been obliged to leave her border with Belgium undefended. In 1905, von Schlieffen presented his campaign plan. It would knock out France in 6 weeks. Most of the German army would race through neutral Belgium, outflanking the French fortifications. They would storm into France and encircle Paris before the French knew what had hit them, pushing the French towards the German guns. With France defeated, her ally Russia would be forced to accept peace on German terms. It was a risky plan. It had to go like clockwork. The planners calculated the unloading times of 11,000 trains, the marching rate of every column of soldiers. The conviction grew that by planning every detail, it would work.
The major shortcoming of the Schlieffen Plan is that what-ifs, yes-buts, and alternate perspectives are never discussed. Officers who might raise those questions are either not appointed to key positions in the General Staff, or if they are marginalized by their colleagues.
Time was running out for the German General Staff. The French and Russian armies were growing bigger all the time. Every year they delayed, the chances of victory grew slimmer. They were being driven to war by fear.
Far from there being a kind of hubristic desire for world domination in the minds of German military planners, their concerns were almost all driven by a sense of insecurity and declining strategic strength.
By 1914, Germany could wait no longer. When the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, it was a feeble pretext. But it was enough. Germany began the Great War. On the 1st of August, the German army set off for Belgium. Von Schlieffen's plan was underway. Yet despite 20 years' work, it was to become the biggest planning blunder of all time.
The Schlieffen Plan was a gamble. Everything had to go right. And yet, by definition in war, nothing goes right. Anything that can go wrong will.
The Schlieffen Plan was to fail at every level. It depended on speed, getting to Paris in just 6 weeks. Years had been spent calculating the rate at which 2 million men could march through Belgium. But the planners had blundered. Their calculations were based on professional soldiers. Yet most of the German army were conscripts, shopkeepers, factory workers, bank clerks. They were being asked to do the impossible.
You have men who are used to walking to the corner grocery store. Now they have to march 20 or 25 miles a day, every day, in boots that are new and need to be broken in. The General Staff officers couldn't calculate blisters. They couldn't calculate dead horses. They couldn't calculate captains and first sergeants that aren't able to deliver hot cooked food to men whose stomachs are used to it. The plan was considered to be independent of these human elements.
Because of these human elements, Belgium would soon resemble the biggest traffic jam in history. Roads clogged with exhausted men, broken down vehicles, and dead horses.
It's hard to imagine any situation in military history in which friction was more likely than the German march through Belgium, which was supposed to happen at unprecedented speed.
The planners had made another miscalculation. They had assumed the neutral Belgians would not fight back. But the soldiers began to encounter resistance. At Liège, the Belgians held up the Germans for 10 days. The Schlieffen Plan had required them to pass through it in 48 hours.
Now you're a junior officer, and all you know is that you've got to be at point B by 0600 hours. Otherwise, the entire fate of the German Empire is on the line. And you suddenly encounter some resistance, you panic. You think, we have to be at point B by 0600 hours, therefore we need to completely dispel any resistance by making some examples. Shoot those two men over there.
The brutal way in which the Germans put down Belgian resistance had an unexpected consequence. In Britain, the tabloid press branded them as beastly Huns. Early filmmakers dramatized real atrocities. The plan was handing Germany's enemies a propaganda gift never envisaged by von Schlieffen.
These thousands of civilian deaths had massive political consequences for the war as a whole. Nothing did more to mobilize British and later American opinion against the Germans than the atrocities perpetrated against Belgian civilians.
By invading Belgium, von Schlieffen had also naively ignored politics. He dismissed a European agreement to uphold Belgian neutrality as simply a piece of paper.
It's one of the great underestimates of modern history, because it underestimates the significance of giving Britain this wonderful pretext for getting involved in the war. The Germans were in denial about the implications of British intervention. And in that sense, one can see the limits of German war planning, the myopia, really, with which the whole plan was constructed.
Now the Germans were fighting the French and the British. All plans for a quick victory had collapsed. It was now a war of attrition that Germany could not possibly win. Millions of lives were to be lost. 4 years of war lay ahead. The Schlieffen Plan, the first big design for war, had failed. Failed strategically because it had ignored the consequences of invading a neutral country. Failed tactically because it had asked its soldiers to do the impossible.
Military planners try to produce a plan which reduces the impact of friction. Those are all the uncertainties and the imponderables on the plan. But by doing so, they sometimes produce a plan which is in a sense bigger than them, which allows no margin for any of those errors which they've tried to massage out of it.
World War I marked a turning point. By now, war had become so complex that planners had become the brain of every army. Like crystal ball gazers, peering into the future, trying to deduce the enemy's intentions. The illusion was that the brightest and best, working together in a group, would lead to success. But the analysis of failed plans shows that this is not necessarily the case, that there are dangers in group planning. Psychologists call it groupthink.
The great danger is this propensity for people engaged in a single task to see things the same way, to make assumptions and heartily agree with them, like a bunch of, shall we say, singing Presbyterians, to heartily agree with the assumptions and then, above all, stop trying to reevaluate them.
The dangers of groupthink were to be vividly illustrated a generation later, resulting in one of Britain's most humiliating episodes of World War II. In March 1941, an extraordinary situation had arisen.